My name is Mitchell Jones. I'm 39 and the Marine Corps was the only world I knew. I'd seen the light go out of better men than me. I thought I understood the threshold. I thought I knew exactly how the end would look. I was dead wrong. We were out in the Arizona scrub for a 2-week training block. High desert night maneuvers, lots of heat, dust, and controlled chaos. The goal was to bleed in training so the boots wouldn't bleed in combat. I'd run these lanes 1,000 times. Check the kit, check the men, execute the hit. It was a well-oiled machine, and that night felt no different than any other exercise in my 20-year career. The mission was a standard night fire assault. Pyrotechnics were rigged to mimic hand-made bombs and mortar splashes. I was the overwatch, the senior observer watching the movement of the fire teams below. The charges were calculated and timed. Everything was on a leash, or so the safety brief said. The error occurred in a heartbeat. A charge that should have been a distant flash detonated practically at my boots. The shockwave wasn't a sound. It was a physical blow that threw me through the air like a rag doll. I remember the sensation of being airborne, the world spinning on a chaotic axis. Then, the brutal impact. My skull met a jagged rock shelf with a sound I felt more than I heard. The agony was a white-hot flash. I felt the warm, rhythmic pulse of blood pouring from the back of my head, soaking into the dry Arizona dust. I fought to move, to key my radio, to do anything a Marine is supposed to do. Nothing. My limbs were anchors. The sounds of the M4s and the yelling became muffled like I was underwater. My team was on me in seconds. I saw the silhouette of a corpsman looming over me, his hands shaking as he worked. I saw the reflected light of a chemlight in his terrified eyes. Someone was screaming for a bird, but the voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The world started to dissolve in layers. The stars didn't go out, they just drifted away. I expected to fight. I expected the warrior spirit to kick in. Instead, I felt a profound, heavy stillness. The panic of the Marines around me didn't touch me anymore. The last thing that registered was the frantic crackle of the radio. Vitals dropping, he's flatlining. Then the world went dark. But it wasn't an end. It was a departure. I was suddenly untethered, standing in a clarity that made my previous life look like a blur. I wasn't in my uniform anymore, but for the first time I was truly awake. The transition was not a fading out, but a waking up. In the Arizona desert, I had known the world through the grain of sand in my boot and the weight of an M4 in my hands. But as the volume of the physical world hit zero, I found myself in a state of absolute clarity that made my finest moments in combat look like a drunken stupor. The pain was gone. The heavy, throbbing sensation of my skull meeting that stone had vanished, replaced by an weightless equilibrium. I was standing, though the concept of standing had changed. There was no ground, no boots, no gravity, yet I felt more stable than I ever had on a parade deck. The desert was a memory. In its place was a realm of pure, living light. This wasn't the jagged, blinding glare of a flare or the searing flash of a thermobaric explosion. It was a light that possessed intelligence. It felt warm, not like heat, but like a deep, intimate recognition. It was a light that knew the inventory of my soul better than I did. I realized then that I wasn't just in a place, I was in a presence. Time had ceased to be a linear march toward a deadline. It felt suspended, a great now that stretched into eternity, making my 38 years of life seem like the blink of an eye. And then in the epicenter of that brilliance, a figure materialized. I didn't need a chaplain to tell me who it was. I didn't need to recall a single Sunday school lesson. Every cell of my consciousness, every fragment of the man I used to be, vibrated in recognition of the source. This was Jesus. But the Marine in me immediately recognized that Sunday school versions of him were woefully insufficient. This wasn't a gentle wanderer. This was the commander of the armies of heaven. The authority radiating from him made every general and commandant I had ever saluted look like a toddler playing with plastic soldiers. His eyes weren't just eyes. They were depths of truth that contained the blueprints of every star and the history of every tear ever shed. When his gaze locked onto mine, I felt a nakedness that went beyond the skin. It was a spiritual transparency. Every classified secret I had kept, every moral compromise I had made in the name of the mission, every hidden fear and every ounce of ego was laid bare. There was nowhere to hide. Yet to my shock, there was no condemnation. There was only a love so fierce and all-consuming that it felt like it could incinerate my failings in a single breath. "Mitchell," he said. The voice didn't travel through the air to my ears. It resonated through the very fabric of my existence, sounding from every direction at once. "You were not brought here by accident. What happened in the desert was permitted so that you could see what must be shown. You are to return, and you are to warn those who still believe they have forever to choose." I tried to speak. I had 1,000 questions, about the core, about my family, about the nature of the universe, but my voice was gone. I couldn't form the mechanics of speech in this realm. He smiled, and that smile held more genuine compassion than I had experienced in my entire career. "You will speak when you return," he assured me. "But first you must witness. The time of man's self-reliance is drawing to a close. Before 2025 ends, 3 warnings will ripple across the earth. They are not punishments, Mitchell, they are mercies. They are the final alarms before the harvest begins, intended to shake those who trust in the permanence of their own hands." The light shifted. I wasn't watching a projection. I was pulled into the future itself. It was a 4D reality where I could smell the salt air and feel the vibration of engines. Jesus showed me the first warning, and it was a strike against the very core of my identity as an American warrior. I saw the Pacific Ocean, vast, blue, and deceptively calm. "This will occur on December 14th, 2025, Jesus stated. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of a decree. "The world will wake up that morning believing in the invincible shield of American naval power. By the time the sun sets, that shield will be shattered, and the myth of human security will begin to crumble." Below me, I saw the 7th Fleet. As a Marine, I knew these ships. I saw the USS Gerald Ford, a multi-billion-dollar marvel of engineering slicing through the waves. Around it, destroyers and cruisers moved in a protective screen that had defined global stability for nearly a century. It was the ultimate display of man's technological dominance over the sea. But the water began to change. It wasn't a storm of wind and rain, it was a storm of energy. From the west, I saw trails beneath the surface. They weren't torpedoes. They moved at speeds that defied the laws of hydrodynamics, weaving and hunting with an organic, predatory intelligence. They weren't following a ballistic path, they were thinking. The strike was instantaneous. The USS Gerald Ford, a vessel designed to withstand a nuclear near-miss, was struck from below. The impact was so massive the entire carrier listed 20 degrees in a heartbeat. I could hear the radio traffic, a chaotic symphony of panic and professionalism. "All hands to battle stations. We have a hull breach. Where did it come from? Radar is blank." What followed was a slaughter of technology. The weapons used against us didn't resemble anything in our arsenal. It was like watching a master combatant fight a blindfolded child. Energy beams bored through thick steel hulls as if they were made of paper. Electromagnetic pulses rippled through the fleet, turning the most sophisticated Aegis combat systems into useless piles of silicon and wire. The water around the ships began to boil, a localized thermal event that trapped sailors in a literal cauldron. The USS Blue Ridge, the nerve center of the fleet, was cleaved in two by an unseen force. I watched the USS Antietam capsize, its crew spilling into the oil-slicked Pacific like scattered toys. In 18 minutes, the pride of the American Navy was reduced to a graveyard of floating wreckage and burning fuel. The most terrifying aspect wasn't the death toll, it was the impotence. Our sailors, the bravest and most skilled on the planet, were firing into empty water. Their sonar heard only ghosts. Their radar saw only clear skies. They were fighting an enemy that seemed to exist in a different dimension, or at least a different understanding of physics. Jesus turned to me, and the sadness in his eyes was a weight I could barely stand. This is not the work of a rival nation in the way your generals understand it, Mitchell. These are technologies born of dark alliances, ambitions of men who have sought power from places that were meant to stay sealed. This is the first warning, that the strength of man is a vapor. I stood there, a career Marine witnessing the total destruction of the world I had sworn to protect, realizing that the preparedness I had preached was nothing but a house of cards. This was only the first vision. My soul was already trembling, and the year 2025 had only just begun to reveal its secrets. The silence of the Pacific was only a prelude. Jesus directed my vision away from the smoking ruins of our fleet and toward the nerve center of the nation. I found myself hovering over the Pentagon, a place I had walked as a man of rank and respect. But the building I saw now was a labyrinth of panic. Emergency sirens wailed, bathing the cold, concrete corridors in a hellish, strobing red light. I saw men and women, officers I had served under, admirals who had projected an image of absolute stoicism for decades, sprinting through the halls with expressions of pure, unadulterated terror. In the Situation Room, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and desperation. Massive screens that once tracked every asset on the globe now showed only the static of a dying empire. I saw the final satellite frames of the 7th Fleet before the feed vanished into a digital abyss. 17,000 American souls, my brothers and sisters, had been erased in less than 20 minutes. The generals weren't just mourning, they were bewildered. Their playbooks were useless. Their strategies were antique. The ripple effect was a physical thing, a wave of shock that moved across the planet. Despite every desperate attempt at a blackout, the news leaked. I watched the global markets go into a terminal tailspin in real time. Numbers on screens, the digital gods of our age, plummeted until they simply disappeared. In Washington, D.C., I saw congressional leaders being pulled from their beds at 3:00 a.m., their faces pale under the glare of flashlights. The president was whisked into the bowels of the earth, surrounded by advisors who could do nothing but shout conflicting, useless theories into secure phones that were already beginning to fail. But the confusion wasn't confined to our borders. In Beijing and Moscow, I saw military leaders staring at intelligence reports that defied the laws of physics. They were realizing, with a chilling synchronization, that they weren't the ones in control. The weapons used against our fleet shouldn't have existed. They were sudden, surgical, and from everywhere. "This is the end of the illusion, Mitchell," the Lord said. His voice was the only thing that felt solid in a world turned to liquid. Within 72 hours, the maritime world was a graveyard. The British North Sea Fleet was rendered into floating scrap metal in an afternoon. In the Arctic, a Russian submarine pack was crushed by an energy that seemed to condense the very ocean water into a hydraulic press of impossible force. Japanese destroyers vanished from their own coastal waters as if they had been edited out of existence. Human treaties were signed in hours between former blood enemies, a desperate, pathetic attempt to band together against a predator they couldn't even name. By the turn of the year, martial law was the only law left on earth. Then Jesus turned my gaze toward the invisible. "The first warning destroyed the sword," he told me. "The second will destroy the world the sword was meant to protect." I looked down at the globe, and for the first time, I could see the digital nervous system of the world. Thousands of miles of fiber optic cables, satellite beams, and wireless signals formed a shimmering, interconnected web. It was the lifeblood of modern man: banking, power, water, communication. And then at 3:33 a.m. EST on January 4th, 2026, the lights began to go out. It wasn't a glitch, it was a dissection. In New York, I saw traders stare at black monitors, their fortunes evaporating into a vacuum. ATMs began to spit out error messages in glyphs and symbols that belonged to no human tongue. Cell towers died in waves, creating a spreading plague of silence. In London, the financial district became a ghost town as the digital space of the exchange simply ceased to exist. In Paris, the power grid flickered in binary patterns that felt like a mocking laugh from the darkness. Jesus took me deeper into the heart of the machine. I saw the great data centers, the humming cathedrals of the information age, go silent. Submarine cables went dark. Satellites began to broadcast mathematical riddles that broke the very computers trying to decode them. The attack was surgical, designed for maximum psychological trauma. Credit cards died just as the first riots began for food. Dispatch systems froze as the cities began to burn. I saw the gridlock in Los Angeles. Millions of people trapped in steel cages on the freeways as the traffic management systems intentionally created a labyrinth of no escape. I saw Chicago's skyscrapers become vertical tombs as elevators stopped between floors and electronic locks sealed shut. But the most terrifying vision was the realization in the bunkers of the world's leaders. They discovered that their secure networks hadn't just been hacked, they had been occupied. Their most guarded secrets, their nuclear codes, their personal sins, everything was being displayed back to them on their own screens. They were naked. They were helpless. And they were finally realizing that they had built their kingdom on the sand of a digital lie. The second warning didn't end with a bang, but with a terrifyingly quiet return to the status quo. For exactly 72 hours, the digital world was a corpse. Analog systems, relics from my father's era, groaned under the impossible weight of trying to sustain a global population that had forgotten how to function without a screen. Then, as if a cosmic switch had been flipped, the lights came back on. The ATMs blinked to life. The cell towers resumed their invisible chatter. The bank accounts showed their familiar numbers. But the world was broken. The invisible glue of trust had dissolved. We realized that the social contract was a lie maintained by fragile circuits. We saw that the entities holding the keys to our survival could lock us out at any moment. People began to hoard, not just food and ammo, but a deep, jagged suspicion of every government assurance. And when the researchers finally dug into the code that had paralyzed the planet, they found the impossible. The intrusion wasn't written in C++, Python, or any binary known to man. It was a digital language that seemed to possess its own soul, a logic that violated every law of silicon and light. Jesus turned to me as the vision of the chaotic, recovering cities faded. The first warning destroyed the myth of physical safety, he said, his voice a low, resonant thunder. The second shattered the systems of daily life, but the third, Mitchell, the third will dismantle reality itself. A shiver raced through my spirit. I had survived combat where the rules were clear: cover, concealment, and fire superiority. But the third warning didn't follow the rules of engagement. It wasn't about technology or hackers. It was the complete tearing of the veil between the world of dust and the world of spirit. January 21st, 2026, the winter solstice, a day usually reserved for astronomers and those who track the shifting of shadows. But Jesus showed me that this date would be the moment humanity's arrogance met its end. I found myself suspended at the edge of the atmosphere, looking down at the blue marble of Earth. It was 06:30 GMT. The sun was rising over the spires of London and dipping below the horizon in Los Angeles. The familiar cycle of a billion years was in motion. Then the impossible happened. A second sun flared into existence. It wasn't a flare, a comet, or a reflection off a satellite. It was a primary celestial body, burning with an intensity that rivaled the sun we've known since the cradle. But the light was different. While our sun is a warm, yellow-white furnace, this new star pulsed with a cold, silver fire. It was a light that didn't just illuminate the skin, it seemed to X-ray the conscience. "Watch closely, Michiel," Jesus said, his presence more solid than the vacuum of space. "This will be visible to every living soul simultaneously. No cloud cover will hide it, no horizon will block it. For 72 hours, the heavens will scream the truth." The orbital mechanics were madness. The silver sun didn't move. It hung stationary over every single point on the planet at once. In New York, workers stood in the streets, looking up at two suns, one yellow, one silver, blazing in the noon sky. In Tokyo, where the world should have been wrapped in midnight, the city was bathed in a brilliant, haunting silver glow, as if the sun had decided to return 12 hours early. But it wasn't just a light, it was a signal. The silver sun began to pulse in deliberate, rhythmic sequences. Long bursts and short staccatos, a cosmic Morse code in a language older than the stars. Every person who saw it understood the message in their own heart, without the need for translation. The harvest has arrived. The internet, still twitching from the January collapse, exploded with footage that no scientist could debunk. Telescopes couldn't focus on it. The lenses blurred as if the silver sun existed in a higher dimension. Governments scrambled, throwing out desperate lies about atmospheric anomalies and experimental optics. But their excuses were hollow. Solar flares don't sit still. Clouds don't glow for 3 days straight. No military on Earth could project a light that reached from the bottom of the ocean to the edge of the atmosphere. The world was finally awake, and the fear was absolute. Religious leaders across the globe found themselves thrust into an unwanted and terrifying spotlight, besieged by millions of desperate souls demanding answers to the impossible. Some, grasping for hope, proclaimed the second sun a radiant sign of divine favor and the dawn of a golden age. Others, trembling in the streets, declared it a final omen of judgment, the beginning of the end of all things. But from my elevated perspective within the vision, I could see that both groups were partially correct and yet completely missing the point. This phenomenon was not about individual favor or immediate judgment. It was about the total removal of doubt. It was the ultimate revelation of the spiritual nature of reality, a stripping away of the veil that had separated the physical world from the eternal for millennia. Jesus showed me specific locations where the impact was most profound, moving me through space and time with the ease of a thought. In Vatican City, I saw Pope Francis kneeling on the ancient, cold stones of St. Peter's Square. The silver light from above did not just shine. It seemed to inhabit the architecture, making the massive pillars glow with a supernatural internal fire. His voice, carried by satellites to billions of viewers, was steady but heavy with the weight of ages. He said, "The time of signs and wonders has returned. Prepare your hearts, for what was prophesied is now upon us." In Jerusalem, the scene was even more visceral. At the Western Wall, I saw Orthodox Jews who had spent decades in rhythmic prayer suddenly collapse in uncontrollable weeping. The second sun cast shadows that defied every law of optics, moving independently of the light source, as if the shadows themselves were sentient. Ancient Hebrew prayers, some forgotten for centuries or tucked away in the deepest recesses of mysticism, spontaneously poured from their lips in dialects they had never studied and languages they did not consciously know. The vision shifted to Mecca, where millions of pilgrims performing the Hajj stopped in mid-motion. The silver fire reflected off the black stone of the Kaaba, creating shimmering geometric patterns in the air that spelled out verses from the Quran that had yet to be written in the physical world. Islamic scholars, watching through digital feeds, would struggle for months to reconcile how light could form physical Arabic script that hung suspended, shimmering with a frequency that vibrated in the very bones of the faithful. But the most significant reactions came from the places least prepared for the divine. In Silicon Valley, I saw tech executives, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the gospel of materialist efficiency, staring at their monitors in a trance of terror. Their satellites were recording data that should not exist. Their most advanced computers were crashing because they could not process the energy signatures being emitted from the second sun. In Beijing, the halls of the Communist Party were filled with a frantic, cold panic. Leaders who had based their entire worldview on the denial of the spirit held emergency sessions as their instruments detected signatures that defied every known law of physics and astronomy. The second sun affected people according to the state of their souls. Jesus showed me the pattern with a clarity that was almost painful. Those who had hardened their hearts against spiritual truth experienced the silver light as a physical weight, oppressive, heavy, and nearly unbearable. I saw atheist professors in prestigious universities canceling their classes, unable to look at the sky without feeling a crushing cosmic judgment. Politicians who had built their lives on the shifting sands of deception found themselves physically ill, doubled over in pain whenever they tried to speak a lie to explain away the phenomenon. Yet for others, the silver fire was a balm of awakening. Christians who had been lukewarm, attending services out of habit rather than passion, felt a fire ignite within them that they hadn't felt in decades. Backsliders who had abandoned their faith years ago found themselves on their knees in grocery stores and parking lots, tears streaming down their faces as the light burned away years of spiritual compromise. Most remarkable were those who had never even considered religious faith. In college dorms, students who had mocked the very idea of God were now reading Bibles with a desperate, starving hunger. In retirement homes, elderly men and women who had lived as secular humanists began to cry out for clergy, sensing that their long-delayed appointment with the eternal was finally here. In schools across the country, the traditional lesson plans were forgotten. I saw 8-year-olds standing before their teachers, explaining complex theological concepts, the nature of the Trinity, the mechanics of grace, the history of the soul, with a wisdom that far exceeded the training of any seminary professor. The children were the most open conduits, their minds unburdened by the cynicism of adulthood. When the third day arrived, January 23rd, the phenomenon reached its terrifying climax. The silver light began to coalesce into recognizable forms. First, angels appeared in the sky. These were not the soft, cherubic figures of Renaissance art, but warriors of terrifying majesty. Their wings spanned miles, shimmering with the colors of a spectrum humans had never seen. Their faces shone with a light that made the sun seem like a flickering candle. Their presence filled every human being with a combination of dread and worship that brought millions to their knees simultaneously. Then at the center of the host, a throne materialized. It looked like crystallized light, solid yet transparent, hanging impossibly stable in the sky. Upon that throne sat a figure whose face was too bright to be looked upon directly, yet his identity was unmistakable to every soul on earth. The Ancient of Days, the eternal judge, had manifested. Jesus turned to me as this final vision unfolded and spoke with a voice like rushing waters. He told me that this was the final warning mark. For 72 hours, the spiritual realm would be visible to every human eye so that no one could ever again claim ignorance of divine reality. The separation between those who belong to Him and those who do not would now become absolute. The psychological impact was total. Stock markets didn't just crash, they ceased to exist as concepts. Traders abandoned their desks to stare at the sky. Transportation stopped. Pilots grounded their planes because they could not navigate through a sky filled with celestial beings. Emergency rooms were flooded not with the sick, but with those suffering from spiritual shock, a profound psychological collapse caused by the sudden death of their materialist worldview. World governments tried to respond, but their efforts only highlighted their impotence. Military leaders found that their radar could track the angels as solid objects, yet missiles and shells passed through them as if they were mist. Scientists held frantic conferences, but their data contradicted every principle of known astronomy. When the 72 hours ended and the celestial host vanished, humanity was fundamentally changed. The old categories of believer and non-believer vanished, replaced by a new, sharper distinction: those who surrendered to the truth and those who began the dark process of convincing themselves it was a mass hallucination. The darker reaction began almost immediately. While churches overflowed and seminaries saw a 5,000% surge in enrollment, a cold, calculated rebellion was forming in the shadows. I saw world leaders meeting in underground bunkers, not to pray, but to plan. They began to craft a narrative of alien intervention or atmospheric neuropoisoning. They feared the loss of their power more than they feared the judge they had just seen. In the weeks that followed, a new type of persecution emerged. It was not based on religious dogma, but on social sanity. Those who continued to testify to the reality of the throne were labeled as victims of post-spectral stress disorder. The governments began to implement cognitive re-education programs, claiming the 72 hours were a coordinated attack on the human mind by an unknown extraterrestrial force. They used the very technology that had failed during the vision to create a digital veil, trying to drown out the memory of the light with a flood of manufactured explanations. I saw the great denial take root in the media. Experts were hired to explain how the holographic event was staged. Intellectuals who had been terrified during the light now regained their arrogance, writing books about the Great Delusion of January. This was the darker reaction, not a lack of evidence, but a willful, violent rejection of the truth in favor of a comfortable lie. The hearts that had felt the light as oppressive now turned that oppression outward, seeking to silence anyone who dared to remind them of the dread they had felt when the sky opened. The world was now a battlefield of the soul, where the memory of the light was the only weapon the faithful had against a world that had seen God and chosen to forget. Governments across the planet, terrified that this global spiritual awakening would dissolve the foundations of secular power, launched desperate emergency protocols to stifle the newfound faith. Universities moved swiftly to purge professors who dared to validate the supernatural reality of the event. Media conglomerates rolled out massive, synchronized campaigns to gaslight the population, insisting that the world had simply endured a rare, collective psychological rupture rather than a divine encounter. This was the great division Jesus had promised, and it began to fracture every pillar of human civilization. Families were torn apart as some members fell to their knees in truth, while others scrambled back into the safety of materialist lies. Marriages shattered in the quiet of living rooms as spouses realized they were now living in two different realities, one of eternal surrender and one of desperate denial. Most devastatingly, Jesus showed me the faces of those who had cauterized their hearts. Even after witnessing the blinding majesty of the angelic host and the terrifying stability of the throne, they chose the comfort of complex lies over the weight of divine authority. Scientists hurried to publish peer-reviewed papers describing the event as a holographic atmospheric refraction. Politicians pointed fingers at rival nations, accusing them of high-tech psychological warfare. Even within the church, liberal leaders began to preach that the vision was merely a metaphorical projection of human hope rather than a literal intrusion of the king. As the vision of the third warning reached its end, Jesus turned to me. His eyes were like a sea of infinite compassion, yet they held the sharp, terrible urgency of a final command. He told me that the age of grace was drawing to a close. After this third warning, once every eye has been forced to see the truth, the great harvest would begin. He explained that those who had trimmed their lamps and prepared their souls would be gathered up, while those who clung to the old world would be left to endure the fallout of its collapse. He spoke clearly of the timing. The removal of the faithful would occur exactly 9 months after my time in the desert, on December 10th, 2025, precisely 73 days before that final third warning. The believers would be spared the coming storm, but those who rejected the signs would feel the full, unmitigated weight of a reality they had tried so hard to ignore. I felt the pull of the physical world beginning to tug at my spirit, but Jesus held me for one last moment. He had a final revelation, a missing piece that explained why a man like me had been dragged into the light. He spoke my name with a voice that echoed through the halls of eternity. He told me I hadn't been chosen for my rank or my military record, though my time in the service had forged the iron I would need to survive the coming months. I was chosen because, despite the blood and the dust of a dozen battlefields, my heart had remained soft enough to recognize the truth. He warned me that this message would cost me everything I had ever built in my old life, but that the weight of it would save souls that were currently drifting toward an ignorant destruction. As he spoke, a massive, invisible responsibility settled over my shoulders, a heavy mantle I knew I would carry until my last breath. These visions were no longer just memories. They were a fire shut up in my bones. I knew that every second I spent in silence was a second where a soul might be lost. If I didn't speak, the blood of the unprepared would be on my hands, a burden too heavy for any mortal to bear. The return to my body was a violent, agonizing transition. It felt as though an entire galaxy was being forced through the eye of a needle, the vastness of my spirit being crushed back into the narrow limits of lungs and skin. The pain was an intersection of the physical and the holy. My consciousness, which had been expanded to touch the edges of heaven, was suddenly trapped behind a veil of flesh. When I finally opened my eyes, the world was a blurred mess of harsh fluorescent light and the sterile smell of a military ward. Machines hummed and beeped around me, keeping a rhythmic tally of my pulse. A young Navy medic stood over me, his clipboard nearly falling from his hand as he saw me looking at him, fully conscious and present. The medical charts would later say I had been dead for 14 minutes on the desert floor and had spent 3 days in a deep, unresponsive coma. They spoke of brain trauma that should have left me a hollow shell, yet here I was, more lucid and awake than I had ever been. The doctors used the word miracle because their textbooks had no other name for it. The first person I sent for was Father Rodriguez, a chaplain who had spent 2 decades watching Marines die and live again. He sat by my bed in that quiet hospital room, his weathered face illuminated by the monitors. I told him everything. I told him of the second son, the silver fire, the angels, and the specific dates Jesus had whispered into my soul. I told him about the coming harvest and the December deadline. When I finally ran out of words, he didn't move. He just sat there in the heavy silence, staring at me with a look of profound, trembling awe. The priest's weather-beaten hands were clasped so tightly in prayer that his knuckles were white against the hospital sheets. "Mitchell," he finally said, his voice dropping to a bare whisper that seemed to echo in the sterile room. "What you have told me aligns with prophecies and scriptures I have spent decades studying in the quiet of the night. The sequence of events, the specific timing of the warnings, the very nature of the signs you describe, this is not the chaotic product of a traumatized mind. This is divine revelation." Hours after I regained consciousness, I felt a certainty in my soul that my life as a Marine was over. It wasn't because of my physical injuries, which had been supernaturally and completely healed, leaving the doctors baffled, but because I had been assigned to a far different kind of service. I tendered my resignation from active duty almost immediately, a decision that was met with sheer astonishment by my commanding officers and a deep sense of disappointment from my colleagues. They had always seen me as a lifer, a man born for the uniform. The hardest part of this new calling was looking into the eyes of my wife, Maria, and trying to explain the unexplainable. For years, she had been my safe harbor. She was the woman who had endured my long absences during 3 brutal deployments to the Middle East, carrying the fear and the sleepless nights alone, wondering if a knock on the door would change her life forever. Our life together had always been built on a foundation of certainties. I was the strong, stable Marine, the immovable constant in her life who never faltered and always knew how to lead in a crisis. She knew exactly who I was and what to expect from me. But the man who returned from the Arizona desert on June 30th, 2025, was not that man anymore. When I sat her down and told her about my death and what I had seen while standing before Jesus, I watched her face transform. It wasn't just grief for the man she thought she lost. It was a deep, chilling fear. She looked at me as if she were staring at a stranger, not the husband she had loved for years. She no longer saw the granite soldier who could face a firestorm without blinking. Instead, she saw a man who appeared less certain of earthly things but possessed eyes that had seen too much of the eternal. I spoke with an almost supernatural calm, uttering words that sounded like they belonged to a prophet rather than a soldier. I told her that the world was about to change forever, that we had to prepare, and that time was dangerously short. Seeing me so fundamentally altered terrified her. And how could I possibly blame her? If the roles had been reversed, and she had returned speaking of celestial thrones and silver fire, I too would have feared that something in the mind of the person I loved had snapped under the pressure. She told me, her voice trembling in a whisper, that she needed time to understand who I was now, to see if the man she married was still buried somewhere inside this new person. She suggested that the children should stay away for a while, just until all of this started to make sense. I didn't respond with a flash of anger or a sense of judgment. I didn't feel rejected because I remembered the specific words Jesus had spoken to me during the vision. He told me that not everyone would understand right away and that even my loved ones would be afraid. But he also told me not to fear, for they would eventually come to me and to the Father when they saw the truth manifest, and then nothing would ever separate us again. So I stepped back. I didn't abandon them. I could never do that. But I gave them the space their hearts needed to process the impossible. It wasn't a final goodbye. It was a test of faith and a temporary separation that I knew would heal in God's timing. Maria is not a woman of little faith, but she is a wife and a mother who saw the man she relied on return from the desert as someone she no longer recognized. That frightened her to her core. However, I am not afraid because I know with every fiber of my being that every word I heard that day is the absolute truth. When the signs begin to manifest and the world is forced to face the realities I saw in the light, I know the Lord will fulfill His promise. Maria and my children will understand, and everything that feels divided today will be reunited in His grace. Just 5 days ago, on July 15th, I chose to be baptized again. It wasn't an empty ritual or a tradition to be respected. It was a public sign that everything I was before had been left behind on that desert floor. Every fear, every compromise, and every part of me that lived only for duty and not for God was buried under that water. Since that day, I haven't sought out a microphone or tried to stand on a pulpit. I haven't looked for the spotlight. I have spent every waking hour in a state of prayer and fasting, asking Jesus to guide my every step. What I have to share is not a story to be told for the sake of curiosity or entertainment. It is an urgent message, a clarion call to awakening. What I saw on June 30th was not a dream or a symbol to be analyzed by scholars. They were scenes of a literal future, as clear as if I were walking through them right now, and they are about to begin. The time of grace is shorter than anyone imagines. It is time for you to wake up, to look deeply into your own heart and ask yourself, if Jesus returned tomorrow, would I be ready? Or would I be found distracted, immersed in the temporary things of this world and completely unprepared? What is coming will be a moment of intense fear for the nations, but it is also a final opportunity for grace for those who choose to respond. Many people ask me how they will know when it all begins. I tell them not to look for dates on a calendar. Look for the signs in your heart. You will feel the urgency of the Holy Spirit pushing you to prepare, urging you to leave hidden sins behind and to reconcile with God, and the people you have hurt. When the signs become visible to the eye, it will already be too late to start the preparation. If you are listening to these words, do not let them pass as just another voice among thousands in the digital wilderness. I am alive by grace to tell you that the time is short, and the things Jesus showed me are at the door. Subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the next warnings we will publish as the events approach. Write in the comments the country you are following from, as we will pray for your nation to find mercy when the heavens shake. Share this message with everyone you love, especially those who do not believe. There will be no second chance when the signs begin. Every passing day brings us closer. Do not remain indifferent. Do not be found unprepared. Jesus is calling those who have ears to hear.